All right, so for this putting it all together video, we're going to talk about how would we create a login functionality for our application. All right, so let's say that we want to create a login form, and when the user logs in correctly, we want to redirect them to another page, another login page. All right, so we'll talk about how we do that. All right, now if we think about that problem that we have, well, what's our problem? Well, we want to, if we break it down, we know that we need to interact with the user here. So we need some page that displays the HTML elements that the user needs to type in their email and password. All right, so we're starting to put all these three pieces together. So we have some HTML that contains our actual form. And we know from HTML that the form we use is the form attribute with text box fields. Okay? Now, by itself, that's just a static page. Well, what do we want to happen? Well, because it's a form, when the user submits the form, we want our JavaScript to execute and retrieve the values that the user entered into the form, validate them against some email and password, and if they're correct, then we want to send them to the index page, or if they're not correct, we want to display an alert that they aren't correct. All right, so let's see how we do that. Let's start at the HTML for that. So here's an HTML page called login.html. All right, our dot type signifying that we're using HTML5. Our HTML element, here's our head element. Now in this case, we're actually including a style sheet just to style our page. Okay. All right, so here's our body. Here's the guts of it. All right, so here's our form. Okay. Now our form, and we'll talk about a couple of pieces that will be important to you here. All right, so here's a form, and you may not have seen this action attribute before. All right, so what the action attribute says is when this form submits, don't post back to this page. I want you to go to this page, index.html. So when this form is submitted, go to this page. All right. Important. Let me say that again. The action attribute specifies what I want you to do when this page is submitted successfully. Okay, or when this form is submitted successfully. Okay, and what's our method? Well, remember from section 1, our method is post. All right, and we're giving this form an ID of login form, and the reason we're giving it an ID is because we need to be able to retrieve this document element so we can retrieve the child elements in it. All right. All right, so there's our form. Remember this, remember this, remember this. All right. All right, so we have a field set in there in the Legends login. Now we have a couple labels, one for the email, one for the password, and one for the button. All right, so here's our input. All right, so we're using input. Our type is email. The name is email. The ID is email. Again, very important. Give it a descriptive ID. You'll see why in a minute. Here's our input for our password. Type is password, name is password, ID is password. And here we're saying that is required. So if you don't enter a field in, a value in, HTML is going to handle the part that says you don't have a value. All right. And here's our submit button. So input type equals submit. All right. So let's just look at that form real quick. And that's what our form looks like. All right. Very simple. So if I try to hit login, HTML5 is because I put that required attribute, is forcing me to make sure that I have values in here before it does anything. All right. All right. Let's go back to our thing. So now we need to include our script that's going to do our validation. All right. So without this part, we don't have any way of actually validating that user. So we need to include a script that's going to do that for us. So here's our script tag. And of course, we're using external JavaScript. So we have a script called login.js that's in our JS folder. Why did I call it login.js? Well, because it handles login in. All right. So don't give me some crazy name. Script login logger.js. All right. Name them based on what they do. All right. So what's going to happen here? Well, this page is going to load. It's going to load these, start parsing this HTML, creating these elements. And it's going to get down here, and then it's going to load the login.js script. All right, so let's go take a look at that script and see what it does. All right, so here's our login.js. We're going to start down here at the bottom. All right, so in the previous putting it all together, I talked about we want to wait until the DOM is completely loaded before we start trying to attach events and retrieve elements, etc. All right, now you already know what this part does, window.onload. All right, and we're going to assign a function to execute when window.onload gets called. In the previous one, you saw me do an anonymous function for that, and I executed it. Well, I can also just assign a name function to it. So here I'm assigning a name function called init. So where's that name function? Well, it's right here above it. All right, so function init. All right, so what does the function init do? All right, so keep in mind, init is not going to execute until the page is completely loaded. All right, so because we have a form and we want to do something when the user submits the form, right? We want to do something when they click the submit button, then we need to have an event. All right, like I said, we're going to talk more about events later, but when we want to do something, when something occurs, we need to listen for some sort of event. All right, now when a form gets submitted, or when the user clicks the submit button on a form, the event that gets fired is called onSubmit. All right, so we want to listen for onSubmit. So what we need to do is say, hey, when this page gets loaded, because we don't know, the onSubmit is not going to happen right when the page is loaded. It's going to happen later when the user has entered in their information and click submit, right? So what we want to do is when this script loads, we want to initialize it. We want to say, hey, when the form gets submitted, I want you to do this. Now go back to your business. All right, so we're going to initialize it and then return control back to the page. Okay, so what are we doing here? All right, we have an if statement and we want to confirm that get element by ID can be used. All right, we know what get element by ID is. All right, so here we're just checking to see if document exists. It's not null, and we're checking to see that get element by ID is a function on document. It will return true if document has this function. That's important because different browsers may not have that available. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, in order to set that event on the onSubmit, we need to retrieve the form that we want to set the submit event for. All right, so how are we going to retrieve that HTML element, that form? Well, we're going to use get element by ID. So we're going to ask the document to get the element by ID. And we're saying the ID that we want is the element with the login form ID. Well, where'd that come from? Well, if we hop back to our HTML, right there, there's our form, and we gave it the ID login form. So this code is going to retrieve the element that has the ID login form, which in our case is that login form element containing these children. Okay, all right, so what do we want to do with it once we retrieve that form? Well, we want to set a function for it to execute when onSubmit event occurs. So login form, we take the element and we say for its onSubmit event, assign the function called validate form to it. All right, so that means that when the user submits, the onSubmit function is going to fire, and we are going to, event is going to fire, and we are going to execute a function called validate form. Okay, so let's take a look at validate form. Here's validate form. All right, so what does validate form do? Well, if we want to validate the form, we need to retrieve the values from the form and do something with them. All right, so how are we going to retrieve the email and the password? What do you think? You guess it, we're going to use document.getElementById. by ID. So we want to get the element by ID with the ID email, and we want to get the element by ID password with the ID password. And we're going to store them in two variables, email and a variable called password. All right, so let's go look at the HTML real quick. All right, so we know that the element with the ID email is an input box. And we know that the element with the ID password is also an input box. So remember, it retrieves objects. So the thing that's going to be in this variable is an object, not a value that the user typed in, the actual node itself. All right, the node object. It's going to be for that input element and the node object for this one. All right, now what we want to do is grab the value from out of that. All right, so we're going to grab the value that is representing what the user typed in. So the way we grab that is we use the value property of that um, node. All right, so the value property of a node is going to contain, if it's an input box, is going to contain the value that has been typed into that text box. All right, so we say give me that input box that's stored in email and give me its value. Its value is whatever is typed in there. Now, since that value is a string, we're going to say give me the length of it, and if it's greater than 0, return true. All right, so basically all we're doing is checking to make sure that they actually typed a value in the page. Okay, and we're saying on the password input box, check the value, get its value, get the length of the value, and check and see if it's greater than 0. And because we have an and, what's happening here, we're checking to make sure that the user typed a value in both the email and in the password. If it is, we're going to return true. Now, remember what I talked about in the previous putting it all together. If I return true, the page is going to continue doing what it was doing. All right, so what was it doing? Well, you remember this attribute? Action equals index.html. All right, well, that's what it was doing. It was trying to post back to there. So it's going to, if I return true, it's going to continue on to that page. All right, now if I return false, the page is going to stay where it is. It's going to cancel that behavior, stay where it is, right? And alert the user to complete the form. Okay, so let's see it in action. Let's see what it does. All right, so we're going to fire it up. Let's return it. Oh, please fill in the form. All right, so let's type in email and a password. All right, so I typed in the email and the password, and notice that it continued doing what it does, and it continued on to index.html. All right, well, what's the problem here? We can't really verify the behavior because we have this required attribute. So we can't get past this required attribute because it's handling what we're doing in our code for. So let's remove the required attribute. Now, it's no longer checking to see if they enter the value. Now, we can check and see if they enter the value. All right? So let's just say we don't enter. Let's refresh this page. Let's say we don't enter anything here, right? Please complete the form. So because I didn't enter anything, the length was 0 for both of these, and that code path returned false. So it went into my else class and said, please complete the form, and it did not post back. But if I enter a value, it returns true and it goes on to my index.html page. So let's look a little bit closer at this from a debugging perspective. All right, so let's go to, I'm not going to do it from there. I'm going to do it from Firefox real quick. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to put a breakpoint here so you can see the different things occurring. Let me minimize this again a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go in here to Firebug. All right, now, Firebug is a good tool for debugging here. All right, so how do I know my page is set up correctly? Well, a lot of times you're going to say, oh, my script's not executing. The first place I want you to look is here in the script tag, right? And if you don't see your script actually showing in here, then that means your script did not load, all right? Notice how my script is showing here. If I didn't have the correct code, if I had a syntax error in here, or I didn't have the script source tag, then this would not be showing in here. And that would signify to me that I either need to check my script source in my HTML page or check for a syntax error in my actual JS file itself. All right. Now let's go here. Let's put a breakpoint here so that you can see when the page loads that this event or this function gets executed. All right. So if I refresh the page, that means the page is loading. Notice my breakpoint stopped right here. All right. So notice my document actually has an object. Well, what is my document? Remember we said the document is the page itself. So notice it's showing login.html. And it contains the getElementById function. So both are true. So it's going to go in here and it's going to grab a reference to the login form. So if I step over, now if I look at this login form, notice that it says #login form. So that's my node name. Let's look over here to the right over here to the watch. All right. So this represents the login form element. All right. So let's look for, actually I don't want to do it that way. Let's put a watch on this particular object. All right. So there it is. There's our login form. All right. Now we can see the child elements here. Notice it contains an input. Notice how it highlighted up there when I hovered over it. The second element is that password input box. And the third element is that login email box. All right. Notice the action is here specifying where I wanted it to go. All right. So we have that form object itself. All right. We have a reference to the form object itself. All right. There's our node name, form, our node type, 1, and our node value, which is null right now because it doesn't have a value. Okay. All right, so now we're going to set the onSubmit event to execute this validate function. So you won't see anything right now because it's just setting that event and waiting for it to occur. All right, and it hasn't occurred yet, so it's not going to do anything. All right, so at this point our page is ready to go. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here in validate form. Okay, now let's try and log in without entering any text in there. Okay, so if I hit log in, all right, notice now my breakpoint stopped here. That's because I said when the form gets submitted, execute this validate form function. So this form is actually executing now. This function is actually executing now. Okay, so I got a breakpoint here. So let's see what getElementById retrieves for us. If I step over and I hover over email, notice that it is that input box. Notice that it says input #email because that's the ID of that input box. The property value is empty and the attribute values are null. All right, so if I do a watch on it, all right, there's email, and it's telling us our values. Notice password at this point is undefined, right? Because we have not retrieved it yet. We have not executed this line of code. So let's execute that. All right, now we have something in password. So we have the input box associated with password. We have the input box associated with email. Again, these are the objects, not the values that the objects contain. All right, so if I hover over value here, notice that I get the empty string. That means that the value that was typed in that input box is blank. I don't have anything. So the length property on an empty string is going to return 0. So email, notice my object, calling dot gives me the value property, which is an empty string, and length is 0. So this is, of course, going to be false. Right? See, that's false. And it won't execute this and because one false automatically says you can't continue on because it won't be true. So we expect for it to go into this code right here. So if I step over, there it is. It jumped into this else clause. So we got the correct behavior and we're seeing our alert function in action here. And we're going to return false. Once I hit OK, code's going to continue executing. And we're going to return false, and it's not going to execute that action. It's going to stay on the page that we were on. All right, so now if I enter a value, all right, and I click log in, all right. Now, again, validate form kicked in. We step over. There's our email object. Notice now the property value has changed. It shows what I typed in there, adrian.tillman@gmail.com. Right? If I step over password, notice now Password contains the value that I typed in there, which I typed in GoFundMe. And now passwords value contains that. So if I hover over email, that value, notice that it contains adrian.tillman@gmail. That's what I typed in. And the length is now 24. So this is going to return true now. Right? And passwords value property contains GoFundMe, what I typed in the box. So its length is going to return 8, and that's going to return true. All right. So now it's going to go to this return true, in which case it's going to say, hey, continue doing what you're doing. Now the action attribute is going to kick in. And what was our action attribute for the form? To go to the index.html page. So it's going to continue on. There we go. All right. And the file's not found because I don't actually have it. All right. So that's it. Take care.